Hello and welcome to Lecture 3. Today we will be talking about ecosystems and the role that ecosystems play on human well-being. So as always, we cover 3 episodes. On episode 1, we will talk about this emerging concept, an important concept for sustainability called ecosystem services. In episode 2, we will talk about another equally important concept associated with the notion of ecosystem services, which we call ecological integrity. And we will finalize our lecture today with our usual interview. I expect that from episode 1, you will learn, understand the concept of ecosystem services, also why we depend on them for our survival, as well as approaches, techniques to evaluate ecosystem services. Episode 1 will be presented in 3 parts. In part 1, we will make an attempt to briefly define ecosystems, mostly for those of you who are not very familiar with ecological concepts. In the second part, we move on to the definition of ecosystem services, and we'll finish episode 1 with our conclusions. Let's start then with the definition of ecosystems. So the term ecosystem was used in the first time around 1930 by the British botanist Arthur Roy Clapham to denote the combined physical and biological components of an environment. So the notion of ecosystem brings together plants, animals, including human beings, and microorganisms occupying an explicit unit of space and time and interacting with each other in the environment. The term ecosystems embodies the concept that living organisms continually interact with each other and with the environment where they live to produce complex systems with emergent properties. I already mentioned briefly here in one of our lectures what I mean by emergent properties, but we will have an opportunity to go back to this very, very important concept in this study of living systems in our next lecture, when we will talk about systems thinking in complex systems. So, from this perspective, ecosystems are such that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, as well as the notion that everything is connected to everything else. There are 2 aspects to every ecosystem. Aspects, or what you could call factors or components. There is a biotic component which comprises the living community, also called the biota. And there is an abiotic component which comprises the non-living or physical environment in which the biota interact. The abiotic component of ecosystems include the physical and chemical factors of an ecosystem, as, for example, sunlight, rain, atmospheric gases, among which nitrogen, oxygen, and carbon dioxide are the most important, wind, water, soil, etc. The abiotic component represents the geological, geographic, hydrologic, and climatologic features of a particular ecosystem. The basic components of all ecosystems have a similar structure consisting basically of producers, consumers, detritus, feeders, and decomposers. I'll briefly describe each one for you. The producers, also called autotrophs, are mostly comprised of green plants which use sunlight, to convert carbon dioxide and water to organic compounds such as glucose and the release of oxygen as a byproduct into a process which is essential to life called the photosynthesis. Producers are mostly identified by a green pigment called the chlorophyll molecule, and they range in diversity from microscopic photosynthetic bacteria to giant trees like the sequoia trees. Next come the consumers, or heterotrophs. The consumers are composed of three types: herbivores, which are also called the primary consumers. These are animals as large as elephants or as small as mites that feed directly on producers. The next category of consumers are the carnivores, which are also called secondary consumers. These are animals that feed on primary consumers. And next comes the omnivores, which are animals that feed on both herbivores and carnivores. The third category of the biota is what we call the detritus feeders and decomposers. By detritus here, I mean dead plants and animal material and excrement. The detrivores are organisms essential to life. They feed on detritus, organisms such as earthworms, millipedes, termites, ants, etc. And they are part of the soil food chain, which is very important for the maintenance of life because they are primarily responsible for recycling, for waste recycling in natural systems. Now, ecosystems vary dramatically from place to place, ranging, for example, from the Arctic ice to tropical rainforests, from sandy deserts to coral reefs, and from high mountains to the ocean depths. Other examples of ecosystems include forests, grasslands, wetlands, marshes, ponds, cities, each with their respective individuals, their species, living in community in a particular environment in time and space. Now, humankind have great benefits from a multitude of resources and processes that are supplied by ecosystems. Collectively, these benefits are known as ecosystem services and include products like clean air, clean water, and processes such as decomposition of wastes, which is, again, as I said, essential to life. Now, while scientists and environmentalists have discussed ecosystem services for decades, the services were popularized and their definitions formalized by the United Nations 2005 Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. This was a 4-year study involving more than 1,300 scientists worldwide. The scientists found 4 categories of ecosystem services. I showed them here to you. The first one they called supporting services. These are services needed for the production of all other ecosystem services. So these are basic. So the other system services won't exist if in case that supporting services are degraded. And these include essential services like, for example, nutrient cycling and soil formation. The second category is called provisioning systems. And this refers to products obtained from ecosystems. For example, food, fresh water, wood, fiber, fuel. The third category is called the regulating services. And these are benefits obtained from regulation of ecosystems. Things such as climate regulation, flood regulation, provided, for example, by wetlands, disease regulation, and water purification. And finally, and not as important as any of the others, we have the fourth category, what they call cultural services. And this refers to non-material benefits from ecosystems, such as aesthetics, spiritual, educational, and recreational benefits. So as you can see, these are all essential benefits for the well-being of humanity. This figure here that I show you is just illustrate an example how the different types of ecosystems provide different type of services. So we start by looking at mountain and polar ecosystems providing food, fiber, fresh water, erosion control, climate regulation, recreation, aesthetic values, and spiritual values. But also other ecosystems like forest and woodlands, inland water, dry lands, cultivated or croplands, urban ecosystems, coastal ecosystems, marine ecosystems, they all provide valuable ecosystem services to non-human and non-human life. This figure here is an attempt to show the close relationship that there is between ecosystem services and well-being. So again, on the left, we have the figure that I already showed you, in which the four categories of ecosystem services are shown. And on the right, you find what we call constituents of human well-being. And it's important to see that the primary constituent here is freedom of choice and action, which is the opportunity to be able to achieve what an individual values doing and being. And the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment divides this in four categories: security, basic material food for good life, health, good social relations. We have all these arrows that connects the different type of ecosystems services to different categories that constitutes human well-being. One important thing to look at here is that these arrows are identified by color as well as by width. So by color, they want to determine the potential for mediation by socioeconomic factors. And these go from low potential to high potential. For example, we can look at here and see that there is a high potential for mediation by socioeconomic factors with the constituent of well-being referring to basic material goods for good life. But there is very little opportunity for mediation if you regard things like, for example, social cohesion, mutual respect, spirituality, etc. The other shows the width, and the width is the intensity of the linkage with the specific ecosystem service with the constituents of well-being. Now, given the close relationship between the different classes of ecosystem services and the relationship to human well-being, scientists and environmentalists have made an attempt to evaluate these natural services, these services provided by natural systems. As we know, many of these services are performed seemingly for free, yet they are worth many trillions of dollars, as I will try to demonstrate in the following minutes. While it is often possible to place an accurate monetary amount on ecosystem services, we can calculate, actually, some of the financial values. Economists, for example, measure the value of ecosystems services by estimating the amount people are willing to pay to preserve or enhance the services. I would start telling you that, for example, ecosystem services have great relevance to prescription drugs. For you to have an idea, 80% of the world's population relies upon natural medicinal products. Of the top 150 prescription drugs used in the United States, 118 originate from ecosystem sources. 74% of those come from plants, 18% from fungi, 5% from bacteria, and 3% from one snake species. Also, it's important to know that 9 of the top 10 drugs originate from natural plant products. So you can have an idea of the relevance and importance of these services, of the natural services provided by ecosystems to prescription drugs. Another important service is related to flood regulation. For example, again in the United States, much of the Mississippi River Valley's natural flood protection services were destroyed when adjacent wetlands were drained and the channels were altered. As a result, in 1993, we had a flood that caused great property damage, estimated at about $20 billion, partially from the inability of the altered valley to lessen the impacts of the high volumes of water. You can see in the picture here on the left, some of the pictures relate to that well-known flood in 1993. Another important aspect of ecosystem service to humanity is the fact that 1/3 of human food comes from plants pollinated by wild pollinators. The value of pollination from wild pollinators in the US alone is estimated at $4 to $6 billion per year. Over 100,000 different species, which includes bats, bees, flies, moths, beetles, birds, and butterflies, provide free pollination services which are so important to humanity. This table here is an attempt to show the relationship between different types of crops and the dependence of those crops on pollination. So you look at, for example, apples. They are 100% dependent on insect pollination. That means in case that pollination ceases for some reason, then we won't be able to produce apples anymore. Proportion of the pollinators, the 100% pollinators that are essential to apples that are honeybees are 90%. So in these tables here, I have the table one, on column one, the different types of crop category. In the second column, you see the percentage of insect pollination on which that crop depends on. And on the third column, you can see the proportion of pollinators that are honeybees. And most importantly here are the value that economists try to attribute to honeybees, measured in millions of dollars. And in the last column on the left, you have the states whose economy are heavily dependent onto those products. In conclusion, many of the goods and services provided by ecosystems are traditionally viewed as free benefits to society or public goods. For example, things like wildlife habitat and diversity, carbon sequestration, scenic landscapes, crop production. Lacking a formal market for these products, they are traditionally absent from society balance sheet. Their critical contribution are often overlooked in public, corporate, and individual decision making, which I would like to anticipate that is something that needs to have our attention. Today, when we talk about sustainability, we are confronted with many definitions, but here, with this brief introduction I gave you, you can find a well-defined conceptualization of sustainability. I would, based on episode 1 of this lecture, to say that sustainability would be, in this case, all about preserving, protecting, and maintaining ecosystem services upon which humanity depends for survival. I would like to suggest you to continue exploring the topic of ecosystems services as discussed in episode 1, and I propose you to look at these 3 questions here. For example, I would like to ask you why the importance of ecosystem services, which we just tried to demonstrate here in episode 1, is often overlooked in public, corporate, and individual decision making. Secondly, how do you think that with the increasing human population and the consequent increase in demand for food, fiber, water, and energy will affect ecosystem services in the 21st century, and how this will affect humanity? And finally, I would like you to think about how the conversion of forests to agricultural lands or croplands impact ecosystem services. Well, I hope that you have learned something about ecosystem services, and in the next episode, I'm going to introduce another ecology concept which is essential to the protection of ecosystem services. See you soon. Thank you.